"Ma'am, you need to move. This seat isn't for you. Economy is at the back." The words hit like a slap in the quiet cabin. No greeting, no explanation, just an order delivered sharp and cold by a flight attendant standing over seat 4A. The woman sitting there looked up slowly. She wasn't loud. She wasn't dramatic. She was calm. But her eyes carried the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime standing firm against arrogance. "This is my seat," she said, her tone measured. "Business class, 4A. Check your list." Passengers shifted in their seats, curiosity sparking. Some craned their necks. Others froze in awkward silence. The plane hadn't even left the gate, and already the air was thick with tension. But the flight attendant didn't back down. Her jaw tightened, and her voice grew even colder. "No mistake. You don't belong here. Collect your things and move. Now." A ripple of disbelief spread through the cabin. Whispers began. "Did she just say that?" one man muttered. Another leaned closer to his wife. She paid for that seat. Why is she being told to move? The woman in 4A stayed perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap. Inside, a storm was rising, but outwardly she was unshaken. She had been here before. Different places, different faces, but always the same silent test. Will you bow your head, or will you stand your ground? Her reply was quiet but firm. "I will not move. This is my seat." That silence again. Heavy. Electric. Passengers now raised their phones, recording, knowing instinctively that they were witnessing something bigger than a seat dispute. The attendant's eyes flashed with irritation, but the woman did not flinch. For a moment, it was as if the entire plane held its breath. And though no one knew it yet, the woman sitting in 4A carried an identity that would shatter this fragile balance of power and bring consequences no one on this crater you ever saw coming. This was not just another flight. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The cabin was still buzzing after the confrontation. Some passengers were whispering, others recording, and a few sat frozen in silence. But the woman in seat 4A remained perfectly composed. Her stillness wasn't weakness, it was restraint. Because what no one around her yet realized was who she truly was. This wasn't just any traveler holding her ground against arrogance. This was a woman who had spent decades navigating a world that often tried to diminish her, only to rise above it with unshakable discipline. Her name was Judge Evelyn Carter. Flashbacks begin to weave into the moment like shadows of memory. We see a younger Evelyn walking into a courtroom for the first time as an attorney. She wore the same calm expression she had now, though her hands trembled just slightly as she carried her files. Colleagues doubted her, whispered behind her back. But when she stood before the bench and delivered her first argument, her voice was steady, her reasoning airtight. That day, she earned respect the hard way, by refusing to be rattled. The scene shifts again. Years later, Evelyn is sworn in as a federal judge. Cameras flash, reporters shout questions, but she doesn't bask in the spotlight. She simply nods, lifts her hand, and takes the oath with quiet determination. She never chased power for privilege. She carried it as responsibility. Back on the plane, Evelyn sat with the same steady composure. She could have ended this confrontation instantly. One flash of her credentials, one declaration of who she was, and the flight attendant's arrogance would crumble. But Evelyn had lived her whole life refusing to wave her title like a weapon. She believed dignity spoke louder than position. Still, the sting of this insult cut deep. Passengers were now choosing sides. A woman AC, Ross the aisle, whispered, "Why are they targeting her?" A man behind muttered, "She has every right to sit there." Yet others stayed quiet, unwilling to get involved. "And Evelyn?" She breathed deeply, her eyes steady, her silence louder than any argument she could make. Because in her mind, this wasn't just about her. It was about every moment she had ever endured where someone assumed she didn't belong, every subtle dismissal, every unspoken prejudice. She thought of her father, who had worked 2 jobs so she could go to law school. She thought of her mother, who always told her, "Don't raise your voice, raise your value." And now here she was, in seat 4A, being told she didn't belong. Again. The attendant shifted impatiently. "Ma'am, I'll say it one last time. You need to move." Evelyn looked up, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I will not." The tension thickened, and even the hum of the engine seemed to fade into silence. Everyone was waiting to see if this quiet woman would bend. But Evelyn Carter had spent her entire life standing straight when others expected her to bow. And soon, everyone on that plane would understand exactly why this woman's silence carried more power than the crew's demands. Because the truth about who she really was about to come crashing into the open. And the crew had no idea how high the cost of their arrogance would be. "Ma'am, I won't repeat myself again. You must move to economy." The words struck like a hammer against glass, shattering the thin patience left in the cabin. The flight attendant's voice wasn't just firm, it was loud now, sharp enough for half the passengers to hear. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. And in that instant, every eye was on row 4. Judge Evelyn Carter remained seated, her posture unshaken, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Outwardly, she was the picture of calm. But inside her chest, the storm raged hotter with every word. "I have a boarding pass for this seat," she replied, steady and deliberate, raising her ticket just high enough. "It's for others to see. This is mine. Business class, 4A. The attendant leaned forward, her tone dripping with disdain. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. People like you can't just sit wherever they want." The cabin gasped. People like you. The phrase cut deeper than the demand itself. A woman across the aisle dropped her jaw. A man 2 rows back whispered to his neighbor, "Did she really just say that?" Several passengers now angled their phones higher, cameras rolling, capturing every second. But not everyone spoke up. Some sank lower into their seats, avoiding eye contact, afraid to get involved. Others looked away, pretending not to hear, as though silence could excuse complicity. The humiliation grew heavier with each passing second. Evelyn could feel the stares burning into her, some sympathetic, some judgmental, some simply curious. She had been under scrutiny before, in packed courtrooms filled with cameras and critics, but never like this. Never as a paying customer simply trying to travel. The flight attendant straightened and crossed her arms, her voice sharp enough to slice through the hush. "Stand up now, or I'll have security escort you off this flight." The words rippled through the cabin like shockwaves. Evelyn drew a long, quiet breath. She would not be baited into anger. Not yet. She had learned long ago that dignity could be the sharpest blade. Still, her silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. Passengers whispered louder now, their voices forming a chorus of disbelief. "This is ridiculous." She bought the seat, let her sit. Why is this happening? And then, the first voice of resistance rose above the murmurs. A man in row 5 leaned forward, his voice strong but controlled. She showed her boarding pass. She belongs there. Leave her alone. The attendant shot him a glare, then glanced at the other crew nearby, as if allying support. Another steward stepped forward, siding with her instantly. "If she won't comply, we'll have no choice but to involve the captain." The balance shifted. Now it wasn't just one attendant against Evelyn. It was the entire crew tightening around her like a noose. Phones kept recording. Tension pressed down like cabin pressure at 30,000 feet, though the plane hadn't even taken off. Every second felt stretched, unbearable, the humiliation like a weight pressing against Evelyn's chest. Her mind replayed the cruel phrase, "People like you." She thought of every courtroom where she'd been underestimated, every headline that questioned her authority, every colleague who had looked past her achievements. And now, here it was again, stripped down to its ugliest form, spoken without shame at 30,000 feet. But Evelyn Carter was not built to break. She lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. "You may threaten, but I will not move. I have every right to be here." For a heartbeat, silence ruled. The engines hummed in the background, the cabin frozen in suspense. The attendants exchanged looks, their confidence wavering beneath the weight of the passengers' stares and the silent judgment of the cameras aimed at them. It was humiliation stacked upon arrogance, and Evelyn was holding the line. No one yet knew the truth about who she was, but the moment of revelation was approaching like a storm, and when it arrived, it would not just clear the air. It would change everything. The silence broke like glass. From the back of the cabin, a man's voice rose above the murmurs. She showed her ticket. "Why are you still harassing her?" Heads snapped toward the sound. For the first time, the tension was no longer contained between Evelyn and the crew. It was spilling into the passengers. The flight attendant froze for a second, startled, before quickly regaining her composure. She straightened her uniform and replied with rehearsed authority. "Sir, this is a private matter between the airline and the Parsi." "Enger, please remain seated." But the man didn't sit back. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "No, it's not private anymore. Everyone here can see you're treating her unfairly." A ripple of agreement spread through the rows. A woman near the window added, "She paid for this seat. Why should she move?" Another passenger muttered, "This is ridiculous." Phones lifted higher now, lenses aimed at the crew like spotlights. The once quiet whispers were turning into open voices, challenging the injustice. The lead flight attendant glanced at her colleagues for support. Within moments, 2 more crew members appeared, standing shoulder to shoulder beside her. Their faces were tense, their stance united. Instead of de-escalating, they were circling their wagons. One of them spoke firmly, projecting her voice down the aisle. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you refrain from interfering with staff decisions. Safety comes first, and disruptive behavior will not be tolerated." But the words rang hollow. Everyone knew safety wasn't the issue. This was something else, something uglier. Evelyn remained still, her expression unreadable. Her silence was louder than all the voices in the cabin, but even she could feel the air shifting from discomfort to open defiance. The man from row 5 spoke again, louder this time. "She's not being disruptive, you are." The crowd stirred. Passengers exchanged nods. Some clapped softly, encouraging him. Others raised their phones even higher, recording every angle. The pressure was mounting, and the crew could feel it. Yet instead of yielding, the lead attendant doubled down. Her face flushed, her tone clipped. "If this passenger refuses to comply, the captain will be forced to remove her. That's the final word." Gasps echoed across the cabin. Remove her? For sitting in her assigned seat? The woman across the aisle shook her head. "You can't be serious. That's outrageous." Another voice chimed in from the back. "We're all watching. Don't think this won't go public." The attendants exchanged uneasy glances, but their pride held them in place. They had gone too far to admit fault, too far to back down. The hostility didn't fade. It grew sharper, like a storm gaining speed. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steady despite the firestorm around her. She had faced intimidation before, in courtrooms filled with hostile attorneys and glaring jurors. But this was different. This wasn't about arguments or evidence. This was about dignity in the face of arrogance. She turned her head slightly, her voice calm but edged with warning. "I will not move. And if you insist on continuing this charade, you will regret it." The words hung heavy in the cabin. Passengers exchanged wide-eyed glances. The attendant stiffened, caught between defiance and doubt. Something in her tone carried authority, something that made even the crew hesitate. But pride is a dangerous thing. One attendant leaned closer, lowering her voice but keeping it sharp. "You're making a scene. People like you always do." The insult wasn't whispered softly enough. The nearest rows heard it clearly. A collective gasp filled the air, followed by angry murmurs that swelled into shouts. "That's disgusting! You can't talk to her like that! Shame on you!" The cabin erupted. Voices clashed, frustration boiling over. Some passengers yelled in defense of Evelyn, others demanded to speak with the captain, and every phone in the room was aimed squarely at the crew. The attendants, once confident in their authority, were now visibly shaken. Their eyes darted nervously toward the cockpit, toward one another, toward the rows of angry faces surrounding them. The tension had reached its breaking point. The cabin wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was explosive. And in that moment, one thought consumed every passenger on board. Who was this woman in seat 4A, and why did she sit so calm in the middle of chaos? The answer was about to stun them all. The cabin had turned into a courtroom without walls, passengers shouting, phones recording, accusations flying through the air like sharp arrows. The flight attendants stood their ground, but their faces betrayed unease. The pressure was breaking them. And in the middle of it all, Judge Evelyn Carter had not moved an inch. Then, slowly, deliberately, she reached into her leather bag. The cabin fell into a hush. Every eye followed her hand, every phone tilted forward, ready to capture what came next. For a heartbeat, the entire plane seemed suspended in silence. Evelyn withdrew a small black case. She set it gently on the tray table, clicked it open, and pulled out a leather-bound identification wallet. Her voice was calm, but it carried the sharpness of a gavel striking wood. "My name," she began, holding up the card, "is Judge Evelyn Carter. I am a sitting federal judge of the United States District Court." Gasps erupted across the rows. A woman clutched her mouth. A man muttered under his breath, "Oh my God." The authority in her words washed through the cabin like a wave. She extended the badge toward the lead attendant. The gold seal caught the cabin light, gleaming for all to see. "This," she continued, her tone cutting through the silence, "is not just a ticket. It is proof of who I am, and what I will not tolerate is harassment without cause." The attendants froze. Their confidence shattered in an instant. They had believed they held power over a lone passenger, but now, standing before them, was a woman who outranked them in every possible way. The lead attendant's lips parted, but no words came. Her face drained of color. The arrogance that had once dripped from her voice was gone, replaced by sheer panic. Passengers erupted. Applause, cheers, voices overlapping. "She's a judge." "I knew something was off." "They're finished." Phones zoomed in on the badge, recording every detail. There was no hiding from this moment, no reversing what had just been revealed. Evelyn's voice did not rise, but it cut sharper than any shout. "You embarrassed me in front of an entire cabin. You disrespected my rights, my dignity, and my humanity. But more than that—" She paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "You disrespected the law." The attendants shifted uneasily. One tried to stammer out a defense. "Well, we were just following protocol," Evelyn interrupted, her gaze steady. "No protocol permits discrimination. No rule book allows humiliation. What you did was not policy. It was prejudice." Her words landed like a verdict. The jury was the passengers, and the decision was unanimous. The attendants were guilty, not by court order, but by the undeniable truth unfolding on every screen recording in the cabin. The woman across the aisle clapped loudly. Others joined in, the applause growing until it filled the air, drowning out the attendant's silence. And through it all, Evelyn remained seated, calm and dignified, her badge still resting in her hand. For the first time, the attendant stepped back. Their arrogance had evaporated, leaving only fear. The passengers' eyes, once curious, now burned with outrage. And every camera was capturing proof that would spread far beyond this plane. Evelyn tucked her identification back into her wallet, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she spoke once more, her tone final, like the closing of a case. "You will answer for this." The cabin roared with approval. The attendants exchanged frantic glances, realizing too late that they had lost control. And as the engines rumbled beneath the floor, carrying the plane higher into the clouds, everyone on board knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a passenger dispute. This was a reckoning. And when the plane landed, consequences would be waiting. The cabin was alive with energy. Passengers whispered, some clapped quietly, and nearly every pushator hone was pointed at the stunned crew. The arrogance that had once filled their voices had vanished. In its place was panic, raw, unfiltered panic. And then came the words that sealed their fate. "Captain," one attendant whispered into the intercom, her voice trembling, We need you up here." Moments later, the cockpit door opened. The captain stepped into the aisle, his presence commanding instant silence. His uniform was crisp, his voice steady, but his eyes narrowed as he scanned the scene. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone more accusation than question. Passengers erupted at once, voices overlapping, each eager to explain the chaos. "They tried to move her. She showed her ticket. She's a federal judge." The captain raised his hand. The cabin quieted, but the tension still crackled in the air. His gaze turned to Evelyn, who sat calmly in her seat, her ID resting in her hand like a gavel ready to strike. She met his eyes and spoke with measured authority. "I am Judge Evelyn Carter, United States District Court. Your crew has humiliated me publicly, demanded I leave my assigned seat without reason, and escalated this into a hostile situation. I expect accountability, here and now." The captain's jaw tightened. He turned slowly toward the attendants. "Is this true?" The lead attendant stammered, her confidence gone. "Captain, we thought she wasn't supposed to be here. You thought?" The captain cut in sharply. "You thought? Did you check her ticket? Did you follow protocol?" No one answered. Their silence was louder than any confession. The passengers broke into murmurs again. Someone clapped. Another shouted, "Hold them accountable!" The wave of support grew, passengers emboldened now that authority had shifted. The captain's expression hardened. "You have embarrassed this airline. You've endangered our reputation, and you've humiliated a passenger without cause." He paused, his voice dropping lower, colder. "This is unacceptable." The attendants shrank back, their faces pale, their posture collapsing under the weight of his words. The once unshakable crew now looked like children caught in the act. Evelyn remained silent, her presence doing more damage than any outburst ever could. She didn't need to argue. The truth was already on her side. The captain exhaled heavily and turned back to her. "Judge Carter, on behalf of this airline, I sincerely apologize. You will not be disturbed again." The cabin erupted in applause. Passengers cheered openly, some raising their hands, others chanting softly, "Justice, justice." It wasn't just support, it was vindication. The attendants, however, stood frozen. Their faces showed fear not only of the judge sitting before them, but of the consequences waiting when the plane touched down. They knew their careers had shifted in a single moment, from authority figures in the sky to disgraced employees caught on dozens of recordings. One of them tried to plead, her voice barely audible. "Captain, please, we didn't mean—" But he silenced her with a glare. "Enough. Sit down. Do your jobs quietly. Nothing more. The humiliation was complete. The balance of power had flipped entirely. What began as a one-sided abuse of authority had transformed into a spectacle of justice, witnessed by hundreds of eyes and recorded on dozens of phones. And through it all, Evelyn Carter sat with the same composure she had shown from the start. Calm, steady, unmoved. Because she knew something the attendants didn't. This wasn't over when the captain walked away. This wasn't over when the plane landed. This was only the beginning. For while the attendants' arrogance had crumbled in the sky, their true judgment was waiting on the ground. And when those wheels touched down, the fallout would begin. The wheels touched the runway with a shudder, but inside the cabin, no one was thinking about the landing. Every passenger knew the story wasn't over. If anything, the real battle was just beginning. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Management representatives will be meeting this flight at the gate." A low murmur spread through the rows. Passengers exchanged looks, some excited, some still angry, some clutching their phones like precious evidence. The attendants who had once strutted down the aisle now stood stiff in the galley, faces pale, eyes glued to the floor. When the door opened, uniformed airline managers stepped on board. Their expressions were tight, their movements brisk. They hadn't even spoken yet, and already the passengers knew. They had been briefed. The lead manager addressed the cabin. "We've been made aware of an incident during this flight. We will be speaking to those involved immediately." One by one, passengers volunteered their accounts. "I have video. I saw everything. They tried to humiliate her." Hands shot up with phones, screens glowing, proof already uploaded to the cloud. The managers listened, their pens flying across clipboards. Each testimony painted the same picture: arrogance, discrimination, humiliation. The attendants shifted nervously, their once proud postures collapsing under the weight of evidence piling against them. Finally, the manager turned to Evelyn. "Judge Carter, may we speak with you privately?" She rose slowly, calm as ever, the hush of the cabin following her every step. Passengers leaned in, phones still rolling, documenting her exit like history in the making. In the jet bridge office, the tension was thicker than the recycled air. The attendants sat to one side, silent, avoiding eye contact. Across from them sat Evelyn, her badge once again resting on the table, not waved, not flaunted, simply present. The manager spoke calf. "Ollie, every word measured. Judge Carter, we sincerely apologize for what you experienced. This conduct does not reflect our airline's values. Immediate disciplinary action will be taken." Evelyn's response was soft but firm. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here for accountability. I was treated with disrespect not because of a ticket, but because of prejudice. That must be addressed." The attendants shifted uncomfortably. One began to cry. Another opened her mouth to protest, but the manager silenced her with a look. Outside the office, the story had already escaped their control. Videos of the confrontation were hitting social media within minutes. Hashtags were trending before Evelyn even left the airport. Clips were shared thousands of times. Federal judge humiliated by airline staff. Headlines began forming in real time. But Evelyn didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice or smile in triumph. She carried herself the way she always had, with quiet dignity. Because she knew the power wasn't in shouting the loudest. The power was in the truth, and the truth was already spreading faster than the plane itself had flown. By the time she stepped into the terminal, passengers were nodding at her, whispering words of support. Some clapped softly as she walked past, a gesture of respect, not spectacle. And Evelyn, steady as ever, offered a small nod in return. She didn't need to say more. She had already said enough. Because in the end, her silence spoke volumes, and the world was listening. The news broke before dawn. Screens lit up across the country. Headlines bold, photos vivid, videos looping endlessly. Federal judge humiliated in first class. Airline fires crew after shocking incident. The world had seen the footage, the demand, the humiliation, the calm reveal. And now, the consequences had arrived. Within hours of landing, the airline released a statement. Their words were sharp, almost desperate. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. Effective immediately, the crew members involved have been terminated. We extend our deepest apologies to Judge Evelyn Carter and to every passenger who witnessed this unacceptable behavior. It was swift, decisive, and irreversible. The attendants who had once strutted with arrogance were now nameless faces in news reports, remembered only for the cruelty that ended their careers. Their voices, once raised in authority, had been silenced by their own actions. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter had become something more than a judge. She was a symbol. Clips of her composure went viral, her calm tone, her steady posture, the quiet dignity with which she spoke truth to arrogance. Comment sections overflowed with admiration. She handled it with grace. She didn't need to scream. The truth was enough. This is what strength looks like. News anchors debated what the story meant. Was it about race? Was it about abuse of power? Was it about the quiet strength of someone who refused to be broken? The answer, of course, was all of it. For every person who had been disrespected because of how they looked, Evelyn's calm defiance was a victory. For every passenger who had been silenced by authority in the skies, her badge was a reminder. Dignity has power. But Evelyn herself never bragged. She gave no grand interviews, made no victory speeches. When approached outside the courthouse days later, she simply said, "I did what anyone should do. Stand firm in the truth. Justice is not about revenge. It's about respect." Her words echoed louder than any press release. Because this was never about just one seat on a plane. It was about fairness, about equality, about the reminder that no one, not even a federal judge, is immune to prejudice. And yet, it was also a reminder that arrogance has a price. A seat can be reassigned, but dignity cannot. In the end, justice had been served, not through shouting, not through anger, but through the quiet, unshakable composure of a woman who knew exactly who she was. And that, more than the firing, more than the headlines, was the true verdict the world would remember. Respect. It isn't earned by uniforms or titles or the authority of a badge. True respect is born from humanity, how we treat one another when no cameras are rolling, when no one is watching. On that flight, arrogance tried to dominate dignity. But dignity did not waver. Judge Evelyn Carter never raised her voice, never lashed out in anger. She let the truth and her composure do the work. And in the end, that was more powerful than any demand shouted in the aisle. What the attendants forgot is a lesson for all of us. The quietest person in the room may hold the greatest strength, not because of their job, not because of their rank, but because of the calm certainty of who they are. This story is not just about a judge on a plane. It is about every person who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or disrespected. It is about the power of standing firm, even when the world tries to push you down. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all, respect is not optional. It is not a courtesy reserved for the powerful or the privileged. It is the foundation of human dignity, because in the end, arrogance can cost you everything. But respect will always endure.